Okay, thanks, Chris. So I want to talk about something that feels both ordinary and radical at the same time, which is building six-story mid-rise buildings completely out of wood, stick frame construction. Good old-fashioned wood construction. Not mass timber, not some hybrid systems, just standard wood. So the question for me is not whether we can build this way, the codes actually allow it, the technology already exists. The real question is really why hasn't Toronto embraced this kind of construction system for this scale of building, and what happens when we finally do this? So this is a picture actually I took last week of our project, which Chris spoke about. It's close to his office, 2760 Dundas. And it's going to be, and I think it's one of the only, if not maybe two, stick frame six-story buildings under construction right now. So this is, for me, where the conversation starts. If we care about the health of our cities, I think we really need to think about what kind of materials we're building out of. Concrete and steel have incredible carbon embodied emissions. And so when we actually compare a six-story building built of concrete and a six-story building built of wood, there's about a 50% reduction in the upfront carbon emissions of a building built of wood. So we really have to think about the kind of fundamental questions about sustainability having to do with materials. So I'm interested in really simplifying buildings, and for me, the only way to do this is through wood construction, because ordinary construction systems really scale well. They rely on local labor, they rely on local materials, local supply chains. They're lighter, faster, and cheaper, and essentially time, as the previous speaker said, time is money. A lot of people are going to ask, well, what's the cost of this? Our Dundas project is coming in at around $320 a square foot, and that's including all the complexities of the below-grade construction, which includes shoring, significant shoring. So I think the future will be built like this, with ordinary materials. TGI joists, 2x4, 2x6 studs, LSLs, OSB sheeting. This is the future of mid-rise, not some exotic materials that are going to come from somewhere else. It's right here in our own backyard. The only change required is the level of coordination that we're going to need to do, and the kind of building modeling and the assembly kind of process. So what's stopping us from building this way? There is a kind of misconception that the codes are not actually allowing us to build at this scale, but in fact, in 2015, the OBC was changed to allow for six-story wood buildings to be allowed. As long as you follow these kind of parameters, sprinklered, 18 meters to the top floor, certain maximum areas of the floor plate, and your fire resistance ratings of typically 1 hour within the residential separations. So there are significant challenges to building this way. The three top challenges are sound, fire, and moisture. There's many others, but those are the kind of top three. So you really have to be kind of rigorous in how you design these kinds of buildings. But these are solvable technical problems. They're not kind of conceptual problems that we need to overcome. And so in many ways, Toronto's really behind on this type of building. Construction system. In BC, where many of these photos are taken, they've been building mid-rise wood buildings for many years, actually even before 2015. But once I think a couple successful projects get built, then the kind of industry rapidly gains confidence, trades gain confidence, and even municipalities start to understand what's happening, and a new normal begins to emerge. So the question is, what could Toronto actually look like if we embraced projects at this scale? Not isolated pilot projects, but entire corridors of wood mid-rise buildings, kind of like how we saw the housing stock of the early 20th century being built in the city. And what's striking is actually how few examples I could find in Toronto. In fact, I couldn't find any examples in Toronto of stick frame six-story buildings. We're finding more of them in secondary markets like Waterloo and Grimsby, which obviously benefit from larger sites and larger staging if they are prefabricated. So our project at 2760 Dundas really became an opportunity to test these ideas at scale. The project forced us really to think differently about structure and also design. The project's located in the Junction, which is really important to understand the kind of history of these kinds of buildings, because many of Toronto's older buildings were timber buildings clad in masonry. So there's a kind of logic and rhythm to these buildings which feels timeless, but really inherently their logic is based on their construction system. So the design really wasn't about kind of inventing something new. It was kind of taking the DNA that we already have within the history of these buildings and kind of adapting them to new technologies using traditional construction systems. And so this is where I think architecture starts to change, because we really have to think differently about how we plan these buildings. Wood inherently has different kind of lateral kind of systems than concrete. You have to think differently about how you kind of stack the plans. Alignment becomes really key, and simplicity becomes really key. And so that's where policy comes into play. You can't have stupid policies that force you to do really complicated plans. The title of this, Prefabrication Rewards Vertical Simplicity and Repetition, is so key, because every irregularity in the plan has consequences to manufacturing and to coordination, fire protection, and so on. So on Dundas, for example, our challenge was to really negotiate the height of the retail with the kind of section, and also understanding the requirement to meet unit mixes. So that all had an impact on how the kind of building laid out in an otherwise very simple kind of form. So because there are so few examples of these kinds of buildings, we had to kind of invent some new details. And one of them was this balcony detail, which became a major problem because of the amount of steel that would typically be required to do balconies. So we came up with this idea of kind of the invisible balcony, which is a very lightweight 2-inch steel grate that's supported on very light steel. And so for me, this is where really innovation happens. It's understanding how the kind of construction constraints can lead to really interesting architectural moments. And so with this in mind, we're actually moving from this idea of construction to manufacturing. On the left is actually a photo taken from the shop that we're actually going to prefabricate the building. This is 1925 Vic Park, our friends at Well Grounded. They're in the shop before us. But the wall panels are going to be prefabricated in a very controlled environment using digital processes and then assembled rapidly on site. So that really changes quality control. It changes how the labor dynamics work on site, and it changes scheduling and I think reduces risk. So what excites me the most about this kind of idea is really, it's not just about one building. It's about kind of repeating this over the entire city, really. And it's repeating this kind of urban typology in many different kind of mid-rise sites. This one's actually down the street at 1650 DuPont, which hopefully one day we'll also build this one. And so finally, the public imagination is really important in this kind of discussion, because if people can imagine themselves in wood buildings, then the stigma around fire and sound and leaks and water all kind of start to become diminished. Also, finally, the idea of policy really matters. We need performance-based zoning that actually has an understanding of the kind of construction systems that we're using for these buildings. This is a study that LGA and SVN did. Conrad was really instrumental in putting this together, but they actually used our Dundas project as a way to promote this idea of simplified zoning parameters that are based on kind of how you're building these buildings. So I'd like to end with this idea that we really want to build the city that we ourselves want to live in. This is a photo by Double Space showing this kind of emerging neighborhood of mid-rise buildings in the Junction. And what's exciting for me is that the newest mid-rise building within this kind of tapestry of buildings is going to be built entirely of wood. Thank you.